трансляции.
Then we can start. Please switch on recording.
Recording in
Iryna, I'm
progress.
waiting for a signal from you when we start. We can start. Hello to everyone. My name is Pavlo Smytsnyuk, and I'm director of the Institute of Ecumenical Studies at the Ukrainian Catholic University. And I am happy to welcome you to this third and final webinar dedicated to international humanitarian law and war law, military law. Webinars that are conducted by a priest and professor of St. Louis at the University of St. Louis in the United States, Afonso Seixas-Nunes. I will not introduce him again because I have already introduced him twice during the previous webinars. He is a specialist in the laws of war, and also as a priest, he has a special pastoral approach to these issues. Although I can see that during the webinars, he's trying to be as dry as possible and precise to the letter of the law. And Professor of St. Louis at the University of
Shall I begin?
Yes, please.
So I'll share my screen as usual. Here we go. Right, okay. Very good. So good morning to you all, or good evening in Ukraine. So first of all, thank you for having me again and to address these problems of the war in Ukraine. Regarding the comment made by Pavlo about my dryness, is because the invitation was to address the legal problems of this war. Is not that this war does, of course, affect us, all of us, and especially as international lawyers, you can't imagine the level of work that we are having in order to address this issue in the most legal and professional way. It's true that I try to put my morality view aside because I want to be as objective as I can be when I'm teaching international law, and then it's up to people to make their judgments about what the law says and establishes for this war. So regarding the presentation of today, probably we will leave in somehow the dryness or objectivity of the law, and we're going to see the reactions of third countries to the war in Ukraine. So when we talk about third countries, we refer to countries that are not directly involved in the conflict. So the rest of the international community, with the exception of Ukraine and from the Russian Federation. And so calling into mind our last two meetings, and especially the last one that got slightly more tense, I wanted just to recap what we have been doing in order to explain where we're going today. So basically in our first encounter, we looked to the laws of war, to the laws regarding the use of force, so which have as a paradigm the legal framework established in the United Nations Charter, all the problems of the prohibition of use of force, the right of self-defense by Ukraine, and the difficulties that the aggression raised in terms of international law. And in order to address the problems of use of force, the competent body of international law is the International Court of Justice, so what we call the ICJ, and we're going especially today to address one of the cases that was addressed by Ukraine and not by Russian Federation to the ICJ regarding allegations of the Genocide Convention. We're going to look at that. Then at the last meeting, we looked to the laws of war. So precisely when a conflict begins, what are the laws that we need to apply in order to the conduct of hostilities to be lawful? So we forget, as I tried to explain, the reason why the states went to war. We put that question aside. And since a conflict begins, what are the kind of laws that we need to apply in order to protect civilians and civilian objects? So the principle of distinction and also the principle of precaution and proportionality. And we looked in a very striking way the new report that was released by Amnesty International that in somehow addresses some criticisms to the way how the hostilities are being conducted by the Ukrainian military forces. And today we're going to see also a problem of universal jurisdiction and domestic law. Domestic law, when I refer to domestic law, I'm referring how the Ukrainian authorities are applying their own laws for the violations of the laws of war that happened in its territory. And universal jurisdiction is what are the other countries doing to punish war criminals for the crimes that happen in Ukraine but are judged outside of Ukraine. So first, starting with the question that was introduced to the International Court of Justice by the Ukrainian authorities. So, as you know, the Russian Federation, the justification that gave for this intervention in Ukraine, especially in the Donbas region at the beginning, was allegations that there were being committed a crime of genocide in that region by the Ukrainian authorities. So the Ukrainian authorities were committing crimes of genocide against the pro-Russian people living in the region of Donbas. And the Ukrainian authorities went to the ICJ asking about the legitimacy of this argument. Well, this was a very, very smart move by the Ukrainian authorities. I think it was really a strike of a genius in terms of international law. And I want to explain how the Ukrainian authorities reasoned, because this got every single academic by surprise, because nobody could expect such a move by the Ukrainian authorities. So first, Russian Federation invokes acts of genocide, the famous crime of genocide in Article 5 of the International Court of Justice, of the International Criminal Court Statute. And so Russian would have the legitimacy, apparently the legitimacy, to intervene in Ukraine for that crime. So Russia is in somehow invoking the right of humanitarian intervention. So humanitarian intervention is a very disputable and debatable right for a state to intervene in another state when that state is violating human rights of its own citizens. So in somehow the Russian Federation was invoking that the Ukrainian authorities were violating in a most serious way the human rights of the people living in the region of Donbas. And in that way, Russia would come into the Ukrainian territory to prevent those crimes of happening. Is this legitimate? Well, the right to unilateral humanitarian intervention is a very debatable one, as I said, but is not accepted today that there is a customary right to a humanitarian intervention. So Russia, even if it was true, let's imagine for a moment that the Ukrainian authorities were committing crimes against pro-Russian people in the Donbas region, is very debatable that Russia would have the right to intervene. Secondly, that right is very doubtful because Russia is one of the countries that is against humanitarian intervention. So if Russia is against humanitarian intervention, another reason not to intervene in Ukraine. But why the idea of going to the ICJ by the Ukrainian authorities came up? It's something that nobody was expecting. And so you have in front of you the case that we have at the International Court of Justice that already has hundreds of pages, when the Ukrainian authorities asked the court to analyze the allegations of genocide under the Convention on Prevention of Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So why was this something coming from a brilliant international mind? Because Russia and Ukraine are both state parties of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide. And according to this convention, Article 9, the states, when they have doubts regarding the interpretation or application of this convention, the authority to analyze those problems will be the International Court of Justice. But is this a good strategy? Well, you know already the answer, because I said it was brilliant. Because, first, if Ukraine wanted to prove that the genocide was being committed rather by the Russian forces, this would be impossible to prove. And secondly, Russia probably wouldn't respect a decision by the ICJ. So why did the Ukrainian authorities went to go to the ICJ? Well, because the court, in order to see if the allegations were true, the court had at the same time to analyze if the convention applies or not to that conflict. And as the court stated in 7th of March, the convention does not apply to this conflict. This was what Ukraine wanted. And why? Because in an indirect way, the court had to say that there was no reason for Russia to intervene for an alleged crime of aggression, and automatically the ICJ had to say that the intervention of Russia in Ukraine was totally unlawful. And this was when the international community, with the authority of the International Court of Justice, got all together to say that what is going on in Ukraine is actually a situation of crimes, because we have already a very prestigious authority in international law saying that there is no reason for the intervention of Russia in Ukraine. So now we have another body of another organ of international law being invoked to this war. So we have all the courts involved with the question in Ukraine, and now is the ICC. And as you know, the ICC is the International Criminal Court, or the Rome Statute, as sometimes people say as well, created in 1998, and both Russia and Ukraine are not state parties of this statute. So the notion of war crimes, the crime of genocide, crimes against humanity, and specifically the crime of aggression, would not be applicable to Ukraine and to Russia. So, however, the Russian Federation had signed the treaty, it had not ratified. I won't explain the differences between these two legal terms, but basically Russia was interested in becoming a member of the ICC, but Ukraine never manifested that interest. This situation changed in Ukraine in 2014, as you can imagine the motives, and Ukraine said and signed a declaration that he would recognize the authority of the ICC, of the International Criminal Court, for the situation happening in Ukraine. The Russian Federation in 2016 withdraw the signature of the ICC statute. So there is no more interest by the Russian Federation to become a member of the ICC. And this raises a huge problem. Because even if the ICC wants to be or would be the right court to analyze the situation in Ukraine and the crimes that are being committed in Ukraine, the fact is that Russia is not a state member of this court, and so the jurisdiction of the court does not apply. But what happened? So we know that the prosecutor of the ICC, who just got in functions a month before the war in Ukraine, so the prosecutor has a very difficult job because he started with a very hot situation. What happened is that 39 countries or 39 states referred the situation to the prosecutor. And I want to explain this thing in a little detail to explain the other strategy followed by the Ukrainian authorities. So when any state, a party to the ICC, verifies that there are crimes happening in another country, they can refer the situation to the prosecutor. The prosecutor then will have the authority and the power to analyze if there are enough facts or if there is reasons to open an investigation. So Mr. can open an investigation for the crimes or alleged crimes being committed in Ukrainian territory. And you might ask, why is the prosecutor opening a criminal investigation for what is happening in Ukraine if at the end of the day, the court won't have jurisdiction over Russia? Well, and this we're going to dig in very specific details of international criminal law. I will try to be as simple as I can be because it's a very, very difficult matter. So the court has jurisdiction only over state parties, so Russia would be excluded. However, under Article 17 of the Rome Statute and Article 18, the court can initiate a prosecution and actually a case against a state that is unable or unwilling to prosecute crimes committed by its own citizens. So the fact that Russia would be unable would not follow because Russia has its own courts and so on. But the prosecutor can get to the conclusion that the Russian Federation is unwilling to prosecute its own soldiers and citizens that are committing crimes in the territory of Ukraine. For that reason, the prosecutor opens an investigation to see if there is enough facts about not only the existence of crimes being committed in Ukraine, as well as to see if the Russian Federation is unwilling to prosecute its own forces by crimes committed in Ukraine. So the ICJ, so the other court, already helped a lot the ICC. Why? Because saying that there is no reasons to invoke that there is a crime of genocide being committed in Ukraine, that the intervention of Russia is totally unlawful in Ukraine, is helping saying that what is going on cannot be lawful. Right. So now, after the prosecutor opens the investigation, he will get to a conclusion, and Russia will have the right, according to Article 19, to answer to the investigation led by the prosecutor. So, is this for
you
me?
may continue? Yes, somebody interrupted.
So where was I? And then the Russian Federation will have the right to answer to the prosecutor. And of course, here the Russians will most certainly block a case at the ICC, because probably Russia will say that is taking care of the case, and everybody that committed war crimes will be judged by the Russian authorities. However, let's talk about the Special Court for the Crime of Aggression in Ukraine. So this idea also came by the foreign advisor of Ukraine, and also for the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, of creating a special crime for the crime, or a special court, I'm sorry, for the crime of aggression in Ukraine. So I just put in these next two slides what can be understood by the crime of aggression. So for the purpose of this statute, crime of aggression means the planning, preparation, initiation, or execution by a person in a position effectively to exercise control over or to direct the political or military action of a state, of an act of aggression which by its character, gravity, and scale constitutes a manifest violation of the United Nations Charter. So we have here a crime that was put into force in 2018, is an amendment that results from the Kampala conference in 2010, and it was added to the court in 2018, that tries to punish the crime of aggression. The crime of aggression is very, very specific, because it addresses the person with control over the political life of a country, of initiate or in somehow execute a crime of aggression against another state. And then you have on paragraph 2, and then you have some examples of what can constitute a crime of aggression. There is more paragraphs, so there is 2 more paragraphs, E and F, that do not apply to the situation of Ukraine. But the paragraph A, B, C, and D, if you read them, you can see that they apply completely to the situation in Ukraine. And so there is all the requirements for a crime of aggression. What is the problem with the crime of aggression that would justify to go to a special court? First, Russia is not a state member of the ICC. So President Putin and his entourage could not ever be judged or prosecuted for a crime of aggression, since they are not members of the ICC. Secondly, the crime of aggression can be referred to the ICC by the Security Council. So the Security Council can actually refer a situation to the ICC, saying this situation happens to be a situation of aggression, and the ICC had to analyze the situation. However, as you know, in order for the Security Council to decide on these matters, it needs to have the vote in favor of all the members or permanent members of the Security Council. Well, the Russian Federation is one of the permanent members of the Security Council, and as you can imagine, the Russian Federation would veto such decision. So the ICC, although Russia, the Russian Federation, according to what is established in Article 8b, fulfills all the criteria to be prosecuted by a crime of aggression. We have President Putin and also Minister Lavrov with the control of the political life of Russia. We have the use of force against the sovereignty and territorial integrity and political independence of Ukraine. So everything seems to be combined for a perfect crime of aggression, but we have these two obstacles. Because of these two obstacles, a set of Ukrainian authorities plus Professor Dapo Akande of the University of Oxford, Professor Philip Sands from the University College London, two of the most senior authorities in international law at the moment, and also the former Prime Minister of the UK, Mr. Gordon Brown, emerged this possibility of creating a special court to prosecute Mr. Putin and his entourage for the crime of aggression. So, what are the limitations of this court? And you will find authors, criminal lawyers. It's coming to mind Kevin Heller, very famous indeed, international criminal lawyer, that thinks that actually the creation of a special court for aggression would be a bad idea. And if you read his article, I imagine that a Ukrainian would get very, very upset, because he is very realistic, as I tried to be in our last meeting. He will say that why he's telling that is a bad idea. First, the problems of gathering evidence. If Russia will never allow the investigations to have access to certain evidence. Secondly, this court would be extremely expensive. Thirdly, we could ask about the opportunity of this court. Well, let me address these issues, because I was in favor of this court and I turned against this court, and at the end of the day, I signed this statement asking for a special court. And I was actually in the first meeting where this court was presented, that you can find it on YouTube, the entire meeting where this idea of a special court of justice, of a special court for the crime of aggression was launched in London. Well, first of all, it's true that to create a special court would be tremendously expensive, and it would depend not in Ukrainian money, but in money from other countries. I have to say that if this is a very valuable argument, because the ICC has been struggling by the lack of money to pursue its mission, we could apply that situation also to the case of Ukraine. However, the situation in Ukraine has raised so much the consternation of almost every single country in the world. If we look to the situation at the General Assembly, when 156 countries condemned the intervention by Russia in Ukraine. So I believe that these states were very keen to support. Actually, the 39 countries that referred the situation to the ICC, including the United Kingdom in a special way, have offered already help. And in the declaration presented, a statement presented by the UK on the 5th of August, so very recently, the British government put at the disposal of the ICC and the ICJ an international legal team to support precisely the investigation of the crimes being committed in Ukraine. Secondly, the problem of evidence. Well, the problem of evidence is a problem regarding the evidence that might be in Russia. But the problem is, but I think the advantage, if we can call advantage of the evidence of this case, is that most of it is in Ukraine territory. And even the weapons that are being used by Russia, by the Russian Federation, we can find them in the Ukrainian territory. And the Human Rights Council, as you know, immediately in March after the intervention, opened an investigation and a special committee for the investigation of crimes happening in Ukraine. And there was a legal team of the Human Rights Council in Ukraine to gather evidence. Then the prosecutor of the ICC was there as well. And then another argument that I think operates in favor of this special court is that the fact that the European Court of Human Rights can also intervene here with its own money and mechanisms of investigation. Why? Because any Ukrainian citizen can go to the European Court of Justice if he is not satisfied with a certain situation and ask for the condemnation or prosecution of Russian authorities. And then the European Court of Human Rights would initiate also an investigation. And at the end of the day, they could also condemn Russia. So there is a lot of mechanisms operating in favor of this special court for the crime of aggression. What are the reasons offered for this special court? Is the fact that he will only look to the crime of aggression. He won't look to any other crime. But as the crime of aggression is considered the most serious violation of international law, to have Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov and others condemned by this crime, he would face imprisonment for the commission of this crime. So another situation that we are finding is how the domestic law of Ukraine, so how the Ukrainian authorities are also applying their laws to condemn the situation, the situation of crimes happening in their territory. So according to the Rome Statute, a country can prosecute according to its own legislation the crimes that happen in its territory. So the Ukrainian authorities and the Ukrainian courts have been prosecuting Russian soldiers that have committed crimes. So we have at the moment very few condemnations, which is absolutely normal. So the war is still going on. The Ukrainian authorities are under tremendous pressure. Most of the Ukrainian courts that were in the occupied territory had to move to the western part of Ukraine. And as you can imagine, the move of courts implies tremendous bureaucracy and also all the problems that moving a court entails. But we have already a Russian soldier that was sentenced to life imprisonment and other two soldiers Russian soldiers for indiscriminate attacks. And we have 25,000 war crimes being investigated. Well, just today, in this last week, a couple of articles were published by very famous international lawyers, very concerned with this situation. So this is a problem that I want also to address. So Cambi Ambos, that is probably the most famous international criminal lawyer in the world, raised lots of concerns about this initiative by the Ukrainian authorities. And what are his arguments? His arguments concern the fact that, according to him, is questioned very much the independence and impartiality of Ukrainian authorities when they are applying the law. Secondly, that the war is still going on, and in order to criminal justice to be applied, there is a need of a more serene kind of environment. Third argument is what are the level of evidence, and what can we know of how the Ukrainian authorities are actually giving independent judgments. So these are legitimate concerns, of course, from international criminal lawyers. At least 3 of them have wrote about this concern, but you have also an article that was just published today from another international lawyer arguing against these arguments. Why? Because the first case that you have, this Russian soldier that was sentenced to life imprisonment, actually he has appealed to the Supreme Court and the court of the appeal court in Ukraine, and the appeal court considered that the evidence that was gathered was not enough for life imprisonment, and actually reduced the sentence from life imprisonment to 15 years. What does this mean? Means that the Ukrainian authorities, although they are in a situation of war, they have the mechanism, the justice mechanisms operating in a way that allows them even to correct sentences that, according to the Court of Appeal, were not accurately done. And so this is a vow in favor of the fact that the Ukrainian authorities are actually performing the application of justice correctly. Secondly, the Ukrainian authorities have asked for help from other legal teams and international legal teams, experts in international criminal law, which the UK is one of the countries helping. Yeah, and it's not a new situation. Lebanon did the same in 2010. So it's so basically what the Ukrainian authorities do is to ask help from other legal teams, more expert in humanitarian law and international law, to help the Ukrainian authorities that are not so expert in these 2 branches of law. But the law that will be applicable is the Ukrainian law, and the judges will be Ukrainian. Then there is the fact that the lawyers that were called to defend these Russian soldiers were victims of some harassment and threats by the Ukrainian authorities. Well, as you know, and one of the lawyers gave an interview saying that, in fact, he received lots of threats from Ukrainians saying that no one in Ukraine could defend a Russian soldier. Well, and I think the lawyer is quite right. So is a principle of human dignity that any person, anywhere should be helped by a lawyer. A lawyer only makes that the guarantees that international justice tries to guarantee to that person are fulfilled. So, and he was able to do his job, and he was actually protected by Ukrainian authorities. So this, in my view, in my personal perspective, shows how the Ukrainian authorities, although they are very much concerned in prosecuting the crimes that are happening there in its territory, which is normal and sane and is good to happen, they also are trying to guarantee as far as possible that all the legal guarantees are present. And this is where I think Ukraine needs to keep going with these efforts to have all these guarantees fulfilled, because Ukraine cannot raise doubts about the way Ukraine is exercising its justice regarding the crimes that are committed in its territory. And actually, the fact that three eminent international lawyers have raised concerns on this regard regarding the impartiality, independence of Ukrainian courts could indeed dismay a bit the other countries regarding how Ukrainians are performing, not only on the battlefield, but also in the way they were exercising justice. So it's, for me, it's very good. It's really helpful, I think, for the Ukrainian cause to see that the Ukrainian authorities, from as far as we can see and know, they are really involved sorry, I lost my reasoning. So the authorities, the Ukrainian authorities are really committed in the right and fair application of the international norms. So in order to conclude today, I will speak less because I expect that many people will have questions. So at the moment, what can we conclude of all these three presentations? So looking to this strictly to international law of use of force, the Russian Federation has violated the most sacred and holy norms regarding the use of force, has violated any parameter of the use of force, and in that way, the international community has shown a tremendous support as never seen before in the General Assembly resolutions in which they were condemned, in which condemned the intervention of Russian Federation. So the first good sign is that the international community is with Ukraine. Then we look to how the laws of war have been applied by Ukrainian authorities and by the Russian authorities. Regarding the Russian military forces, of course, there are questions if the Russian authorities are not committing indiscriminate attacks, so attacks that violate the rules of proportionality and the rules of distinction. So the Russian forces are not putting enough precautions and due care in distinguishing who is a combatant and who is a civilian, what is a civilian object, what is a military object. And also from the weaponry point of view, as you know, the Russian Federation have been using cluster munitions. Cluster munitions are forbidden by international law. It's true that the Russian Federation is not a party of this treaty, so in certain how this convention would not apply to the Russian forces and they could use cluster munitions. However, there is an emergent norm or customary international law forbidding this type of munitions. So Russia would not be only committing war crimes, but it would also committing crimes regarding the type of weaponry that is being used by their forces. Regarding the Ukrainian authorities, we've seen that this report published by Amnesty International raised some great questions of how the Ukrainian authorities are performing on the ground. So the fact that if it is accurate and correct, so this will depend very much on evidence, and Amnesty International is very much involved in protecting the Ukrainian people. Maybe it's a wrong report, maybe the report has also true facts. I don't know, I didn't have access to the evidence. But as we've seen on Tuesday, if it's true, and there is a big if it is true that the Ukrainian authorities have used hospitals, religious buildings or monuments to hide soldiers, or also to hide weaponry or military equipment, they put themselves, civilians, at risk. And in that sense, the Ukrainian authorities would also be committing violations of IHL. What is the problem of this? Not only causing the death of Ukrainian civilians, as in the international forum, Russia could not be accused of war crimes if Ukraine was also violating the norms of war. Then, in this last section, we looked to the international support that is being given to Ukraine. Not only this statement of the Special Court of Justice has been signed, when I signed, there were already more than 200 international legal experts signing that court, which is actually a very, very strong support. And I signed this statement 2 months ago, so I presume that now it's probably thousands, and probably people are not aware that the weight that international lawyers have in the way that the international justice is applied is considerable. And then we have not only technical support by other countries like Latvia, United Kingdom, France, have already supported also Ukraine with legal teams to gather evidence and to process the evidence, let alone all the support that Ukraine is receiving from a great number of countries in military equipment. It's true that since yesterday, if I'm not mistaken, it's the Ukrainian authorities have been noticing that Russia is performing a new type of attacks in Ukrainian territory, which is the cyber attacks. So internet access to internet, global news, etc., is being blocked by Russia. It's true that from what I understood yesterday, that the Ukrainian authorities are trying to meddle this situation, and they are getting some success, and also that other countries are helping Ukraine to have access to free internet, if we can call it that way. But it's true that Russia won't rest until they get what they want. Then, in terms of international justice, can we be hopeful? I think, I don't know, regarding the Special Court for Aggression, I think we can be hopeful. Regarding the war crimes committed by Russian forces, there is a big question mark. If President Putin remains as the president of Russian Federation, I see very little hope. If there is a change in the government, maybe there is lots of hope. What is true is that Russian Federation and the Russian authorities are completely isolated in the world at this moment, apart from the economic interests of China and India and some 4 or 5 African countries. As you know, the European members of parliament are already discussing if every single Russian tourist should be expelled from the European Union, and the passports of Russian citizens should be banned as well in the European Union. So in somehow, although I cannot even imagine the pain that Ukrainian people are going through, it's true that the international community is doing the best they can in order to protect Ukraine and to recover the political and sovereignty of the Ukrainian people. So on my behalf, I would finish here. I don't know if there is any other questions or points that people would like to raise, but I would like to thank again this opportunity of helping in anyhow Ukraine. I'm also writing an article about the situation in Ukraine to be published. So, you know, apart from my vocation of praying for Ukraine, of course. So thank you very much. And now I think if Pavlo and Iryna agree, we could open the floor for questions. Thank you. Right.
There's a question in the chat.
Oh, okay.
We've got questions in the chat. I will read them in Ukrainian and the translator will translate. Do the churches that suffered in Ukraine have any chances to get some retribution from Russia through the international courts?
Sorry, can you repeat that? Because I was reading the question.
So again, so are you listening? Are you listening now, Professor
I
Afonso?
am. Sorry, I was distracted reading the questions.
So
sorry.
the churches that have been damaged in Ukraine, do they have chances to receive some payment, some retribution from Russia through the international courts?
Regarding compensation, regarding the jurisdiction of the ICJ, I don't know how this case will be developed, because the Ukrainian government only asked for provisional measures to be applicable. So the ICJ has pronounced and guaranteed these provisional measures. It's true that Russia is not obeying. Regarding the International Criminal Court, if there will be considered war crimes, the destruction of religious buildings, and it's not only religious buildings, it's monuments, government buildings, we need to see how this will go, because it's true that Russia could be condemned, but the problem will be that if the courts will have jurisdiction over Russia, or if there will be any change in the government of Russia, and Russia would pay compensations ex gratia to Ukraine. So that remains to be seen. But in theory, theoretically, yes, it's possible. If in practice will happen is another question.
Дякую. Друге питання. Провокація від України – це розміщення військових в цивільних місцях.
So should I read the question that is on the chat and answer them, or should I wait for more questions?
I'm translating now. Provocation from Ukraine. Provocation from Ukraine. Is it the location of equipment, or is it locating some military personnel in the civilian locations? So it's about equipment, or it's about the military personnel?
So both, actually. So if, for instance, and this, I know it was very tricky to some Orthodox priests in Ukraine. So the fact that some military personnel wanted to, you know, they were under attack. Ukrainian forces were under attack, and they seek protection in a church. And the priest or the pastor that is there needs to make this decision if he opens the door or not. If he opens the door to Ukrainian soldiers, if the Ukrainian soldiers are not wounded, because when a soldier is wounded, is no longer a combatant and is protected. But if he opens the door to Ukrainian forces seeking refuge in a religious building, the building can be considered by the Russian authorities as a military target under Article 52. We've seen this on Tuesday. However, the Russian military commander would need to make an assessment of proportionality, and we know how Russian military commanders are assessing proportionality. Regarding military equipment, the situation is even worse. So if any military equipment is being hidden or kept in protected buildings such as hospitals, as Russia has said about the hospital in Ukraine, or in religious buildings, or anywhere, it's also putting at risk the civilians and the buildings, yes. There is a very long question on the chat. Can I address this one?
Так, зараз я його зачитаю. Які юридичні інструменти можна
Which legal instruments can be used for prosecuting Russia for cyber attacks?
Wow, that's a difficult one. So the cyber technology and cyber war is one of the topics more discussed at the moment, and there is the Tallinn manual organized by a set of experts, which is mandatory. No, it's not mandatory. It's a set of recommendations regarding what can be constitute an act of war and use of force in terms of cyber technology. So if a cyber attack is of the same dimension as an armed attack, it will face the same consequences and it will be considered a war crime. So basically, we would apply the Roman statute or special conventions for cyber attacks. But cyber technology faces other issues because they need to be as serious as, although there is a huge discussion among scholars if to what level a cyber attack could be considered an armed attack. And for instance, Netherlands has been losing the criteria in order to accept that a cyber attack against the economy of a country can be considered as an armed attack. So cyber is, unfortunately, is still a no one's land, and every single country are trying to regulate cyber technology in international affairs, but much work needs to be done in order to regulate. But if the cyber attack is of the proportions of an armed attack, the consequences would be the same in terms of application of international criminal law.
Afonso, you mentioned a big question in the chat. Maybe it was a personal question to you. If we don't see it, was it a big question in English?
No, it was about it. No, it's a person that is making available the report of the Amnesty International, which I haven't read yet. I have just read the conclusion, and yeah. So we
Це
have.
питання від Наталі Отенко.
It's a question from Natalia Otenko. I will read it out loud.
Okay.
If Russia is not an ICC member and has not signed international documents pertaining to the rules of conducting war hostilities, and the report by Amnesty International talks about the importance of keeping to these rules, so then should we consider this Amnesty International report?
Right. So regarding the right. So first of all, one of the rules of international law is that the non-reciprocity of the laws of war. The fact that one of the parties not complying with the laws of war is not an excuse to the other part stop respecting them. So, as I said, I haven't read the report of Amnesty International, and even if I read it, which I will because I'm writing about this, is the question will be always the access to evidence. So it's very difficult, these reports, to operate if Amnesty International is not giving enough evidence of that is happening. However, I think I wouldn't give too much importance to this report, because why? Is a big call. That is, if it's true what the report says, it's a big call for the Ukrainian authorities about what they are doing. And with this, I want to say, maybe I was not able to explain so well in the last meeting, is in the fog of war, there's always violations by both parties. In the fog of war, people are under stress, fear, emotional, etc., etc. So we understand that. And we understand that the Ukrainian forces, running away from combat, they seek refuge in a hospital, or the Ukrainian authorities ask the hospital to keep weaponry, in the stressful environment that the war is. However, understanding doesn't mean that is legal or lawful. And actually, there is no rule forbidding the Ukrainian authorities of doing so. What there is the possibility of interpreting those civilian objects as military targets. And so the interpretation given by the Russian authorities may be lawful. So, and so this is the big call. And I think that the Ukrainian authorities, and probably they are doing this, I have no questions because I was in certain meetings with Ukrainian ministers, and from as far as I could see, the level of stress is really, really high, which is understandable, but I never seen in all the meetings I was in any attempt not to respect rules. But so I think the Ukrainian authorities are very much committed in respecting international law. So what I would say is that Ukraine has the duty to respect the laws of war because it's a state party of the Geneva Conventions and additional protocols. So that is what I want to say. And there is here a comment by Dave, I can't see the entire name, but I think it's David. In the Oklahoma City domestic terrorist bombing about 20 years ago, the president of the American Bar Association volunteered to be defense counsel.
Read it aloud so it can be translated.
Oh, sorry.
For the
I thought you could all see it. Oh, sorry. So just a comment, Father, in the Oklahoma City domestic terrorist bombing about 20 years ago, the president of the American Bar Association volunteered to be defense counsel to assure a fair trial. That goes to your point about impartial defense. Perhaps the courts in the Ukraine can ask for volunteer defense or appoint them. So that is more a comment, and thank you for that. Yes, this is an example more in domestic terms of what Ukraine can do and is doing, in the sense that Ukraine actually asked help for legal teams with experts in international criminal law, which are the most important ones to evaluate the evidence that they can gather, but who will apply the justice will be the Ukrainian authorities. So the Ukraine will have all the authority to prosecute Russian soldiers and Russian authorities. Right. And
yes, thank you very much. There is also a comment from Olha Nedavnia with a link to an article, and I think in an interview by the chief of Ukrainian office of Amnesty International, who resigned after this report was published. Now, Pasічник хоче задати питання. There is a question. Будь ласка, включіть камеру і задайте питання, а потім ми глянемо ще на інші коментарі. Я не бачу вашого імені. Пасічник. Будь ласка, так, включіть камеру.
На жаль, камера не працює. Можна задати питання?
Pasічnik, please, I don't see your name, but you are welcome to ask your question. I have two questions. Question number one, can any case be viewed as a process against the regime of Putin in general, the destruction of the Chechen people, all the military actions, the explosions of buildings in Russia, then the destruction of Aleppo in Syria, the killing of Litvinenko and Skripal, attempts to corrupt politicians in the West, then compromising activity against Western leaders. So is it possible to start a case against the regime of Putin in the wider context? And the second question, maybe it is possible to go even further to condemn Russian chauvinism and imperialism. In the historical context, the beginning of the First World War, the Second World War is the liability of Russia. Of course, we cannot prosecute now these people, but we can prosecute the followers. Then in his work, Yuri, in his work, Third Empire, condemns the blackmailing with the nuclear power. So when we leave this like this, then Putin-like people will appear in future again. So maybe judging, condemning, prosecuting and condemning the Russian chauvinism would be apt. How perspective and how possible it is to suit against something like Russian chauvinism and Russian imperialism in general. Thank you very much for your question.
So first, regarding the first question, so the first question is true that the information that, well, is, let's put this in a diplomatic way. It's not new that the Russian authorities use methods that are not recognized by international law. Well, we have lots of cases, putting even aside the situation in Ukraine. If international law has the instruments to condemn Russia for everything that is less legal, I would say no, in the sense that I know that this is very difficult. Sometimes when I'm teaching these aspects to my students, they also struggle to understand that international law depends on the sovereignty of states. So there is no rule in international law to which states didn't have to give their own consent. So if international law would start picking and criminalizing every single and prosecuting every single measure that the state does not act in a correct way, it would get impossible. However, there is, and I'm trying to answer now the first and the second. I think the condemnation of President Putin already exists, and exists by his own people. The level of detentions, of torture, of disappearances, of many other human rights abuses are being reported on a daily basis. So it's true that any person in Russia that can have access to free internet, they start confronting what they hear in the country with what they see on the international news. And so that is raising lots of internal issues. But the Russian authorities have not been complacent with their own people. And answering now the second question, I think in every single book that has been published in the last couple of months, and even before, I think maybe the war in Ukraine has raised all the eyebrows of everyone in the world. But since the war in Crimea, that the quantity of books that have been published about Russian politics and Russian policy and Russia intervention are huge. So I think the condemnation of the current government, or which is not, even with President Medvedev, the problems were already there. So it's not just President Putin is the original. These problems come from a long time ago. So I think that there is actually a strong condemnation by the rest of the world of what is going on. And even regarding China and India, that are clapping of happiness with this war in economical terms, because they are able to buy natural gas and oil much lower prices. It's true that India has, and even China, raised lots of concerns about the intervention of Russia in Ukraine. So I think it's impossible to find any book of history that won't condemn Mr. Putin and all this situation. What I think is that it's very important to have present all the intellectual framework that President Putin has at the moment. So I think I had the opportunity to explain this in the first meeting, the neo-fascist writers that Mr. Putin writes, the influence of Ivan Ilyin in his thought, Gumuliev and so on, that actually have made Mr. Putin believe that he's the leader that is expected to lead this Russian civilization to the rest of the world. So the famous concept of Eurasia and so on. So I think he deeply incarnates this level of intellectual madness. In my perspective, I'm sorry if I'm offending someone, but for me it's intellectual madness. And what the history also shows is that if you poke the bear too much when he's crazy, we can face consequences. So this is also to justify certain diplomacy of the international community when they are dealing with a government such as Mr. Putin's government.
Yes, thank you very much, Afonso. There is air alarm in many parts of Ukraine right now and in Lviv. So I think we should probably end and allow people to hide in the shelters. But I would like to thank you for your said lecture, for all series of the webinars which you did. It wasn't easy for us. It wasn't easy for you, but I'm glad that we managed to do this and. In a way to breathe a little bit of this legal dry legalism. Yes.
I don't agree with the dryness, but okay, we'll accept that.
So I see there are still questions, but I think that maybe the team from Lviv, it will be safer for them to leave the webinar. What I would like to do, I would like to thank my team, especially Iryna Kitura. I would like to thank our interpreter, Галю Вираю, Helena Pastushuk. You can see her for interpreting. And I would like to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation in Ukraine for their support of this project. So thank you very much. Please go in your shelters and hide. And thank you, Afonso, for being with us.
No, thank you very much. And anything you need, just give a shout, and I will help as I can.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much. Tremendous lecture, Father, and everybody put it together. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Дуже всім дякую.
Thank you.